Hello, viewers. Welcome to another episode of Stories Lost. Get ready for a classic case. It's Italy, humanoids, and a down-to-earth mother of four. You might already know who we're referring to, Rosa Lotti Dainelli. If the name rings a bell, you've definitely done your UAP homework. If not, let's find out. Busine is the kind of place where nothing much happens, unless you count winemaking and Sunday Mass as high-octane action. Tucked away in the Tuscan hills, it's all olive groves, sleepy piazzas, and old stone buildings that have probably seen more gossip than history. For centuries, the biggest disturbances here were the occasional bad harvest or a particularly heated argument about cheese. But then, in 1954, Rosa Lotti Dainelli went for a morning walk and came back with a UFO story that would put this tiny village on the map. She wasn't some attention-seeking prankster. She was a church-going mother of four, a woman who had barely even seen a movie. And yet, there she was, telling a story about strange little men, a bizarre metallic craft, and a morning she would never forget. The Italian Air Force wasn't impressed. The locals, however, had questions. Did she really see something? Or did Busine's slow rural life finally make the universe decide to drop in for a surprise visit? Whatever happened, for one brief, strange moment, Busine wasn't just another sleepy Tuscan village. And Rosa wasn't the only one who swore she had seen something that defied explanation. If you've ever had an interest in European ufology, the case of Rosa Dainelli is probably familiar. But due to popular demand, we're finally covering it. At first glance, this might sound like an isolated event, a strange but random occurrence. But here's the thing. These kinds of encounters aren't unique. As Jacques Vallée wrote in Passport to Magonia, stories like this, of unknown beings arriving in strange craft, taking objects, and vanishing without a trace, have been reported all over the world for centuries. And these stories would be amazing, and nothing more if it weren't for one strange commonality. A constant feature of folklore and UFO encounters alike is that these beings, whatever they are, seem obsessed with gathering things from our world. Plants, animals, soil, even human belongings. From Europe to the Americas, witnesses have described small entities collecting samples before disappearing into shining crafts that ascend into the sky. Sometimes it's plants, like lavender or wheat. Other times it is livestock or even manufactured items. Take Gary Wilcox, a dairy farmer in New York, in 1964. He claimed that two small humanoids in seamless suits approached him, speaking smooth artificial English. They told him they were from what you people call planet Mars and wanted to learn about fertilizer and soil conditions. After asking their questions, they simply vanished into their craft, never to be seen again. So, what happened in Busine that morning in 1954? Was Rosa just another link in this strange pattern? A pattern that stretches across cultures, continents, and centuries? On the morning of November 1st, 1954, 40-year-old Rosa Lotti Dainelli set out on what should have been a quiet, uneventful walk. A farmer's wife with 4 children, she was on her way to the church in the village of Cennina to place carnations at the foot of the Madonna Pellegrina in celebration of the saint's feast day. A devout Italian woman, she dressed for the occasion in her best clothes, including a pair of new shoes. The route to church took her along a dirt path through an area thick with shrubs and trees. To keep her shoes clean, she carried them in her hands along with her stockings, planning to wash her feet at a friend's house before arriving at her destination. She knew the path well and had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. Her mind must have been far from science fiction speculation. Yet what happened next would become one of the strangest cases in Italy's 1954 UFO wave. As she walked past an open grassy space, she suddenly saw an object unlike anything she had ever encountered. Standing upright before her was a torpedo-shaped craft with sharp, pointed edges, as if 2 cones had been placed base to base. The metallic structure had an opening in its lower half, through which she could see two small seats inside. She later said the thing was a sort of double cone, over 2 meters high and about a meter wide in the middle. Another statement of hers mentioned, the object was very swollen out in the middle and pointed at the ends. It seemed to be covered with leather. The outside of it shone as though it was a very polished light metal. On the lower cone, there was an open glass door, and inside it could be seen 2 little seats like those used by children. In the central part of the spindle, where it was widest, there was a sort of roundish glass, closely following the round shape of the mysterious machine. Rosa Lotti had heard no sound from it. It was completely unfamiliar, and not only that, she would soon find herself in strange company. Of course, Mrs. Dainelli was puzzled to find such an odd object way out in the middle of nowhere, but her puzzlement became astonishment when 2 small figures stepped out from behind the spindle to confront her. These figures, she told the press, were almost like men, but of the size of children. The figures were not dwarfs, since their bodies were of the right proportions for their 1 meter height. Their faces were human-like and had friendly expressions. Moreover, the 2 small men were dressed in a gray-colored material that covered them completely, even covering the feet, and the outfits included short cloaks. Of their general appearance, Mrs. Dainelli remarked, they were very fine-looking even though rather old. They spoke an incomprehensible language, using many short words beginning with L, like loi, lie, and lo. The men were very jovial and apparently eager to establish some sort of communication. The non-threatening circumstances enabled the farm woman to study the little men's features. The eyes appearing very intelligent, the teeth short and thin like a rabbit's. But the ears were non-visible due to red-colored leather-like helmets. They had what seemed to be a convexity at the center of their foreheads. Evidently unafraid of her, the small beings grabbed the flowers in one of her stockings, examined them briefly, and then tossed them into their craft as if collecting souvenirs. Not exactly the behavior one might expect from alien visitors, if that's indeed what they were. One of the beings, who seemed older than the other, then produced a small brown-colored box and pointed it at Mrs. Lotti Dainelli. A camera? A weapon? She had no intention of finding out. Fear took over, and she bolted, screaming as she ran across the fields to the carabinieri. By the time she returned with a group of witnesses, including police officers, the craft was gone. Some skeptics later claimed the whole thing was a hoax. French UFO debunkers Barthel and Brucker suggested that the Senina case was just something a local journalist had made up. But as Dr. Roberto Panatti pointed out, that claim didn't hold water. He and others had met and interviewed Mrs. Dainelli personally. She was a real person, salt of the earth, and even had her photo featured in Life magazine. Father Don Guido Bilardi, the parish priest, had no doubts about Mrs. Lotti Dainelli. She was a pillar of his congregation. The locals thought well of her too and saw no reason to doubt her story. The Italian Prato UFO study group later investigated the case and found that, aside from a few extra details and clarifications, her story remained the same. Even 18 years later, she remembered that day in November 1954 vividly. She told investigators that fear only hit her once she started running. During the encounter itself, she stayed surprisingly calm, enough to get a good look at the little men. The men's upper lips weren't oddly shaped as some articles had claimed. They looked normal. Their faces were also clean-shaven. As for the craft, it wasn't actually covered in leather, as some had suggested. It was just a similar color, with a dull, matte finish. Other small details were also clarified, like the type of tree near the craft, not a pine but a cypress, and that the beings took all the flowers but only one stocking, as well as the exact color of the small box the older one was holding. One thing she was especially firm about: she never saw the craft vanish or take off. She had turned to run and never once looking back. A separate UFO group, Le Courrier Interplanétaire, found that the village doctor knew Mrs. Dainelli as a stable, reliable person. On top of that, her family was poor and barely literate. They didn't own books, a radio, or even go to the movies. In fact, she had seen only one film in her entire life. Given all this, investigators found it hard to believe that her story was just some fantasy inspired by science fiction. Whatever happened, for one brief, strange moment, Bucine wasn't just another sleepy Tuscan village, and Rosa wasn't the only one who swore she'd seen something that defied explanation. Because on that very same day, November 1st, there was another witness. It's early morning on the Levan-Bucine Road in Arezzo. Andrea Livi, a floriculturist from Montevarchi, is driving his small truck with his son when he spots something unusual: a reddish, spindle-shaped object falling into the Ambra woods. Almost 20 years later, when he was interviewed, he didn't just tell investigators what he saw. He brought them back to that moment, putting himself right there on the road again. Yes, I remember. It was All Saints' Day, and it was early in the morning. I was driving my small truck up the road from Levan to Bucine, heading towards Ambra, Rapolano, and then planning to stop in Asciano. At one point, just below Bucine, I saw a big reddish thing shaped like a cone, falling from the direction of Florence towards Siena. It disappeared among the trees, and I didn't see anything else. In the cab with me was my son Vittorio, and I asked him what that red thing could be. He had been dozing off, but he opened his eyes just in time to see it too. After finishing all my errands, on the way back after noon, as we passed through Ambra, I noticed a crowd of people and asked what had happened. Someone said, "They've seen Martians," and I said, "That's the thing I saw this morning." I wish I'd never said that. Even the authorities showed up. The next morning, the Carabinieri captain came to my house, and there was an interrogation. I told them what I had seen, and that was it. If instead of being at that spot, I'd been on the road from Bucine to Capanol, I might have seen more since that thing was just beyond the road. For me, it was there 1 second and gone the next. I saw that big red streak and that red cone-shaped thing. It was about 2 meters in size. It was just an instant, because it appeared and disappeared so fast. Bucine isn't the kind of place where you expect the extraordinary. Life moves at a steady pace. Harvests come and go, church bells ring, and the biggest surprises are usually found in the vineyards. But on one morning in 1954, something happened that set this quiet Tuscan village apart. Whatever it was, it didn't belong, and it left the locals with plenty to talk about. A lot of people were convinced Rosa Lotti Dainelli wasn't a storyteller. She wasn't looking for attention. And yet, her account remains one of the strangest in European UFO history. Small beings, a metallic craft, and a brief encounter that captured the public's very intrusive interest. Skeptics dismissed it, some even claiming it was a journalist's invention. But those who met her, including investigators and researchers, found her to be credible, grounded, and unwavering in her account, right down to the smallest details. That's what makes this case difficult to explain. She didn't embellish, didn't change her story, and didn't seem to have any motive for making it up. And yet, the incident fits into a pattern seen in many other encounters. Again and again, reports describe strange visitors gathering samples, plants, soil, small objects, things that seem mundane, almost arbitrary. If this were a fabrication, why such an odd focus? Why not something more dramatic, more in line with traditional science fiction narratives? Why beings who don't steal technology or weapons, but carnations and stockings? And if this was an attempt at deception, why create a story so difficult to categorize, so absurd it almost works against its own credibility? Jacques Vallée saw these cases not as isolated incidents, but as fragments of something that has always been present, reappearing throughout history, shifting only in the way we interpret it. Emerging sections of the underlying pattern have been discovered and mapped in ages past by long-dead scholars, he writes at the end of the chapter on Rosa. We are not witnessing something new, only another recurrence, shaped by the ideas and expectations of our time. And just as before, they seem to be supplying the clues. Perhaps they aren't here to conquer or manipulate, but to observe, to interact, maybe even to guide in ways we don't fully understand. Quite cryptically, he writes in Passport to Magonia, a new mythology was needed to bridge the stupendous gap beyond the meaningless present. They provided it. So what's he getting at? Maybe it's this. When the world stops making sense, when the usual explanations don't cut it anymore, something steps in to fill the gap. Not gods, not fairy tales, but something that feels just real enough to keep us guessing. The children of the unknown might not be here to give us answers. Maybe they are the question. A way to shake us out of thinking we've got it all figured out. Because, when it comes down to it, science rules over a very narrow patch of ground. And if that's true, then encounters like Rosa Lotti Dainelli's may not be so random after all. Hey, that's it for us this time. Seriously, we couldn't do this without you, our viewers. Your insights, your stories, and everything you share in the comments keep this going. So if you enjoyed this episode, hit like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the unexplained. Your support helps us keep uncovering these always important and sometimes lost stories, one case at a time. We would like to welcome our new members to the channel. Our new supporters on Patreon. Thank you for the coffee. And thank you for the super thanks. See you next Friday.